Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Wiley, Rein Election Law and Government Ethics Group podcast. I'm Rob Walker. I'm of counsel in the Election Law and Government Ethics Group, and I'm here today with my colleague, Dan Pickard, who is a partner in Wiley Rein's International Trade Group, and also, perhaps more importantly for today's podcast, the co-chair of the firm's national security practice. And my colleagues and I in the election law group, a team with Dan and our mutual colleague, Tessa Capilotto, frequently in providing guidance to our clients relating to the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And hello, Dan, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, Dan, on June 10th, a new bill was introduced in the Senate in connection with the Foreign Agents Registration Act. What can you tell us about that bill?
Sure. So the Foreign Disclosure and Registration Enhancement Act of 2019, as you said, was introduced on June 10th, and it's an amendment to the Foreign Agent Registration Act, FARA. And basically, FARA is a disclosure statute that requires agents acting in the United States on behalf of certain foreign entities to register with the Department of Justice. And really, there's kind of three prongs to the statute. It requires an agent acting in the United States on behalf of a foreign principal. And a foreign principal could be a foreign corporation, a foreign person, a foreign government, or a foreign political party. And that agent has to be engaged in certain types of covered activities, including political activities, but it's pretty broad. It also includes being engaged in certain activities to change the perceptions of the American public, also covers certain public relations or political consulting activities. And it also includes activities where you're soliciting or distributing things of money for a foreign principal. So a lot of people have a tendency of thinking of FARA as just really being an international lobbying disclosure act, but it's far broader than that. And if you meet those three prongs, and if there's no exception that's applicable, then those agents have to register with the Department of Justice and disclose the activities that they're involved with.
So what concerns drove the introduction of this new bill?
Sure. So there's been growing interest and concern in regard to the enforcement of FARA for several years. And I think it's a popular misconception that this really tied only to the beginning of this new administration. But the reality is, this goes back to at least 2012 when we started to see more and more media stories about possible agents being involved in the United States on behalf of foreign principals who were not registering for FARA. And I think the media first really kind of sunk their teeth into this because they started to become more aware that all of the filings at the Department of Justice under FARA are publicly available. So it became very useful for reporters to start to mine those records. But on top of that, there was an Inspector General report at DOJ that had raised some concerns about a lack of enforcement and decreases in the amount of registrations that were taking place, which then also triggered some activity on the Hill. And then as a result of the 2016 elections and some of the subsequent developments, there's been growing developments that the bottom line was that there were a lot of people who were engaged in registrable activities, but who were not, in fact, properly registering with the Department of Justice.
So getting to a bit of the nitty-gritty here, what does the new bill provide? What's in it?
It creates more teeth in the law. It gives the Department of Justice more authorities. And probably the biggest thing out of it is it creates civil demand authority, which is another way of saying that it gives legally enforceable authority to the registration unit at the Department of Justice that's responsible for administering FARA. It gives them a legally enforceable tool to demand information or testimony from individuals that it has concerns are not properly registered. As compared to what is currently, or what has traditionally been going on, that's when the Department of Justice became aware of an entity that it had concerns was not registered, they would send a simple letter of inquiry asking what activities that individual or that agent was involved with, and why they hadn't registered. And it was a more voluntary notice. And now, and the largest part of the bill really has to do with the civil demand authority. It essentially allows DOJ to issue subpoenas for interviews, testimony, and the production of documents relevant to FARA registration. While that's the biggest part of it, there are many other elements of the law, again, having to do with giving more teeth for the enforcement. It increases the criminal penalties under the statute. For example, some of the fines, which were set at a relatively modest $10,000 per violation, have been increased to $200,000. It creates a new criminal offense for agents who are registered under FARA for not informing a member of Congress or congressional staff that they are, in fact, a registered agent when meeting with them. It creates a prohibition that should an agent be fined, that their foreign principal can't pay the fine for them. And then it's got some more kind of broader enforcement issues. It requires the Attorney General to develop a comprehensive strategy for enforcement, creates an obligation for regular reports to Congress, and it requires an audit of the use of the Lobbying Disclosure Act exemption, which is maybe worth talking about a little bit.
Sure.
Under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, we talked about the fact that there are three prongs. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That you've got to have the agent in the United States, the foreign principal, and certain covered activities. But there are a variety of exceptions that exist under the statute, including for some types of commercial activity, certain types of humanitarian activity. But one of the most frequently used exceptions is the Lobbying Disclosure Act exemption. What the LDA exemption basically says is, if the foreign principal is not a foreign government or a foreign political party, in other words, if the foreign principal is really a corporation or a natural person, an agent in the United States can choose to register under either the LDA or under FARA. And I know one of your questions early on was, well, what were some of the concerns that drove the new bill? And one of the largest concerns was an perceived abuse of the LDA exemption, that certain individuals were choosing to register under the LDA when really the ultimate client, the ultimate foreign principal, was a foreign government or a foreign political party. So that contributed in large part to a lot of these concerns. And it's included in the act that DOJ and other elements of the U.S. government are going to be involved in auditing entities that use the LDA exemption.
And is it right that previous proposed reforms to FARA might have eliminated that LDA exception, and this version dials that back a little bit and calls for the audit that you're talking about, at least at this time?
That's exactly right. So Senator Grassley's initial bill proposed removing the LDA exemption in its entirety, and there was a lot of concern about that. And I think many of the concerns were well-founded. If the LDA or if the Foreign Agent Registration Act is ultimately really a national security act, if its fundamental concerns are making sure that the United States government and the American public are aware of entities that are involved in certain activities in the United States that are supposed to be, or that are intended to change U.S. domestic or foreign policy, that should be the heart of the enforcement of the act. And the Department of Justice is always, in my opinion, has always administered the act and the regulations kind of consistent with that spirit. And I think you can make a distinction between entities that may be involved in work on behalf of foreign corporations or foreign persons where the national security concern is missing. And it seems to me that use of the LDA exemption would be appropriate in those circumstances. Right. Really, what you want is, what I think is appropriate is for the registrations under FARA to be as consistent as possible with the fundamental concern. And the fundamental concern has always been pretty closely tied to a counter-espionage concern.
So given all that and what this bill seeks to do, what are the prospects for the future on this bill?
Well, and I get asked that question a lot, and not infrequently mentioned that my crystal ball has been cracked of late. But I think, and there are some sources out there that have ranked the chances of success for this particular bill in kind of the ballpark of 50-50. But more than that, I would say that it seems to me that there is support on both sides of the aisle for doing something about FARA. And I think some of the more interesting developments are that there's some voices, there's some people are talking about perhaps narrowing the act, and in exchange for that, providing more enforcement tools for DOJ. And I think what specifically is being kicked around a little bit is we talked about the covered activities involve foreign or political activities, really trying to influence the U.S. government or perceptions of the American public. I think that part's going to stay in the law. And it's, again, fully kind of consistent with the heart of the statute. But we also talked about the fact that other covered activities include kind of public relations, political consulting, helping a solicitor distribute monies. And I could see how there might be some type of compromise where FARA is narrowed to go more directly to the national security concerns, perhaps even dropping out some of the public relations aspects of it, and in exchange providing DOJ with some of the enforcement tools that I think would be appropriate. And first and foremost, probably the civil demand authorities.
Well, thanks, Dan. This is certainly an area that we're going to stay on top of, and we look forward to having you back to talk about other major developments in this area. And thanks to all of you for listening to our podcast today.